We're actually starting in a previous chapter, and it's going to be essentially a third-person narrative, and then we're going to go into our protagonist's first-person narrative. The Dragon Lord had taken an arrow to the thigh and had gone down. Distracted by the battle going on around them, his men hadn't noticed, and they pressed the battle away from his location. Desmond watched helplessly as 2 of his men went down with fatal arrow wounds. Another was cut down by a Saxon sword. He reached up and grabbed Guinevere's handkerchief that he still wore into battle, summoning his resolve. He tried to stand, but the pain in his leg was too intense. Soon after, men were setting fire to the huts of the village. Desmond tried to call out. He found he had little strength. Looking down, he saw the blood pooling by his leg. The arrow had punctured his femoral artery. If no one found him, he knew he would be dead before morning. If the flames from the huts caught the nearby trees on fire, he wasn't sure whether he would die first from blood loss or the forest fire. He tried to rise again, but an overwhelming urge to lie down and sleep hit him. He fought to keep his eyes open. It was then that he noticed a wolf standing by a nearby tree. The wolf approached slowly and tentatively. Desmond made an effort to look it in the eye, to let him know he was not afraid of the creature. However, his eyes went wide as he watched the creature assume the form of a man wearing a wolf skin. At that point, Desmond began to wonder if he was hallucinating. Without word or prelude, the man who was a wolf reached out and grabbed the arrow shaft and ripped it from Desmond's leg. The Dragon Lord's scream was lost among the screams of those dying in the nearby village. The wolf lapped up the blood that spurted from the wound. Summoning an inner resolve, Desmond lunged forward, pushing the creature with all of his remaining strength. He felt his nose plow into the creature's shoulder. Without thinking, Desmond clamped down with his teeth and felt the blood flow into his mouth. Too determined, or perhaps too weak to let go, he held on and kept pushing until he lay atop the creature. As he swallowed the blood, he sensed that he was gaining strength, but he also grew dizzy from his own blood loss. At last, everything went black. From the writings of Angus Desmond. I awoke some time after the wolf creature attacked me. My head swam as though I had consumed far too much mead, and at first, that's what I thought had happened. I closed my eyes for a few minutes to let my body get its bearings. I was flat on my back on cold, hard ground. Last thing I remembered, I was in the forest, moving my fingers around. I felt no leaves, no twigs, no mud, only solid rock. My eyes flew open as a hunger pang struck. At first, all I saw was darkness, but then my eyes began to adjust and I was able to make out some details, a craggy ceiling and flickering light. I tried to sit up, but couldn't quite summon the strength. I think I must have moaned as I lay there because a shadow fell across me. Turning my head, I realized it was the wolf creature. He knelt down beside me. His head was completely bald, and even in the wan, flickering light, I could tell he was unnaturally pale. The creature's ears seemed unusually large to me, though that could have been because he was bald and they stuck out slightly from his head. The tunic he wore had a wide neck, and it was ragged, threadbare, and dirty. I noticed a nasty-looking wound on his neck, and that's when I remembered biting him. I looked down and saw a ragged hole in my plaid pants. Tentatively, I touched the wound, and though it still hurt and my fingers came away bloody, it seemed amazingly well healed for a place where an arrow had pierced a major artery in my leg. The wolf creature looked longingly at my bloody fingers, but didn't move. Instead, he spoke to me in a language I didn't completely recognize, but the intonation reminded me of the Saxon tongue. As he spoke, I saw 2 large, wolf-like fangs in his mouth. He rolled his eyes as I narrowed mine to examine him. He spoke again, and somehow I began to understand. The meaning of his words was, "You need food." The actual words were incomprehensible, though if I didn't listen too closely, I found that the meaning was clear in my mind nevertheless. "Do you have food?" I asked in my native language. He shook his head. "I can show you." Again, even though he spoke in the Saxon light tongue, I found I could understand his meaning. He reached out and helped me to sit. There was the sound of water in the distance, as though we were near a waterfall. He stood and took my hand. I put my arm around his shoulder and he helped me to hobble toward the cave's entrance. As we moved awkwardly together, I managed to bite my tongue. At first I was tempted to spit out the blood, but the taste seemed to awaken something within me. I realized what I was craving. "Do you have rare meat?" I lisped. My mouth felt strange. "It is not meat you crave," he answered. As we continued forward, I felt around my mouth with my tongue. The lisp made me think that I must have lost teeth in the fighting. Though I had been lucky before, I knew it was certainly a possibility. However, I found not missing teeth, but rather that 2 of my teeth seemed unusually large. "What do you mean it's not meat that I crave?" I asked. "I know what my stomach is telling me." "Not yet," he said. We arrived at the cave's entrance, and I realized that we were at the edge of a waterfall. Moonlight glinted from the water. From the direction of the moonlight, I realized that a night or 2 must have passed since I'd fallen in battle. The wolf creature helped me find footing on stones that led from the cave to the riverbank. He then led me down the river a short distance until we came to the remnants of the Saxon village. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air. Despite the cold, flies were everywhere. Few bodies actually remained. Not far away, I saw fresh burial mounds. "Those that were able buried what dead they could in the short time they had available," explained the wolf creature. "Most have fled." "Most?" I asked. "The wounded and those too sick to travel are still here." He led me into the burned out remains of a hut. There was an old woman lying on the ground. Her skin hung on her bones like the wrinkled flesh of an overripe fruit that had sat on the ground too long. Unable to move, the woman lay in her own filth. I tried to turn away, but the wolf creature put his hand on my elbow. "You have the power to end her suffering," he said. I shook my head, not understanding what he meant. He knelt down next to the woman and raised her head into his lap. Her watery eyes opened and she looked up at me. The mind behind the eyes was so far gone that I could not read the emotions. I would like to imagine that she was pleading for help, but what I probably saw was fear. If not of me, then fear of having been left alone. The wolf creature gestured that I should kneel next to him and the woman. A new instinct began to dawn, and I suddenly realized what it was I truly craved. I shook my head violently, even as the hunger pangs compelled me to kneel down. The old woman's eyes followed me as I leaned in and bit down on her jugular vein. Her blood flowed into my mouth, and I swallowed greedily. She made a noise, and at first I thought she was going to scream. However, it soon became apparent that she was moaning, as though remembering some long-lost lover. The woman had little blood left, and she was soon quiet. The wolf creature reached down and gently closed her eyes as I sat back, horrified at what I had become, and even more horrified by the fact that I still suffered hunger pangs. He looked at me with sympathetic eyes. "You still hunger?" He was becoming easier to understand. I nodded fiercely. "All right," he said, laying the old woman's head down. "One more, and then it will be time to rest, whether you are hungry or not. The Neun Toten do not require much blood, too much, and we become sick." The word Neun Toten caused me to blink. I heard the word in the wolf creature's language, but for some reason I didn't understand what it meant. "Neun Toten," I asked, pronouncing the word slowly. "I will explain later," he said. He helped me to my feet and took me around behind another hut. There was a young child lying on the ground. Gangrene was already setting into an arm that was twisted at an impossible angle. The child's breathing was shallow. She was unconscious, near death. Again, I shook my head, and outside the confines of the hut, I backed several steps away. My leg was already getting stronger, and I found I could walk without the wolf creature's assistance. "I can't take the life of this child," I cried. The wolf creature looked at me with fire in his eyes. "She was abandoned for dead." He stood up and began to move closer to me. "You ordered the attack on her village. Very possibly you killed her father and mother. You are the one that left her to suffer." I turned away and hid my face in my hands. The wolf creature spun me around, grabbed me by both shoulders, and stared into my eyes. "You are the one responsible for this child's condition. You will end her suffering now." I could feel the spittle on my face with each word. The hunger in my stomach warred with the revulsion at the idea of drinking blood from the child. The wolf creature pushed me down into the mud next to her body. She stirred as though having a nightmare, but did not wake. With tears in my eyes, I bit into the child's neck and drank her blood. When she was dead, the wolf creature helped me stand. "She is in a far better place now than the place you left her, rotting and suffering in a mud hollow." The creature turned his back on me and made his way back toward the cave. Looking around, I found a shovel abandoned by the Saxons. I dug 2 holes near the other burial mounds and placed the body of the little girl next to the body of the old woman. As I covered them over, I wondered if the woman was the girl's grandmother. When I finished, I threw the shovel deep into the forest and found my way back to the wolf creature's cave. I had many questions I wanted answered. I found the wolf creature in the cave, warming his hands by the fire. His back was toward me, and he didn't look up, but I could see his back tensed as though he heard me. "I still hunger," I said, "but I can't bring myself to eat any more." "That is for the best," he said softly. "The hunger is worst when you are newly reborn. It is better not to attempt to satisfy it. Those that do become very sick." I moved around and sat opposite the fire from the creature. "I have many questions. My name is Wolf," he said, as though plucking the questions directly from my mind. He said the name like wolf, but I understood him to mean the animal whose skin he wore. I smiled slightly, and he nodded slowly. "I chose the name because of what the animal means to me," he explained. "My name is Angus," I said. "I was named for the god of choice. Will I need to choose a new name?" Wolf shook his head. "The name I was born with has no meaning in the modern world. I barely remember it. I have been alone so long, I simply chose that name so that I would not forget." I narrowed my eyes and I studied the creature carefully. "How old are you?" "I have lost count of the years," he said. "Although I remember a time before the Caesars, when the Greeks had an empire of their own. I was created by a vampire that called himself Taraman, which means hunter. I was a slave in his house, and this was his way of setting me free." My mouth fell open as I tried to count the years. 500 or even 1,000? My mind began to reel. Once again, I let my tongue play over the new sharp teeth that had grown in my mouth. Again, questions came into my mind. "You are now like me, Neuntoter, undead." When I shook my head, he continued, "I fed on you like you fed on those poor creatures in the village. I drained you of most of your blood, but then you attacked me." He pointed to the wound on his shoulder. "You drank your own blood that had passed through my body. Doing so, you became Neuntoter." I looked down at the ground, my mouth working helplessly. I wasn't sure what to say. From his tone, it seemed as though he was seeking an apology. "I'm sorry for your wound," I said, "but I'm not sorry that I'm still alive." He looked up at me with moist eyes. "That's the problem. You are not alive. You did die. but you exist still, and the only way you will continue to exist is by drinking the blood of the innocent. I could starve myself to death. He shook his head. I have tried. You will become a mindless husk. Eventually, that husk will seek and kill for blood. It will keep killing until you become like a living being again. It is better as we are. We only need a little blood. We do not need to kill. I jumped to my feet. You made me kill that woman and that girl, I shouted, and stomped away to the far wall. They were already dead, he said in the same level tone. When you became Neuntoter, it is hard to control the hunger. You ended the suffering. It is better than what happened to me. I turned slowly and looked at him. A tear slowly made its way down his pallid cheek. My daughter was only 3 years old, he said before his mouth slammed shut over the words as though afraid of the torrent that might follow. You brought me into this life that's not a life? My words were clipped and I took several short steps toward him. Again, he shook his head. No, I merely fed off you. My only intention was to slake my thirst. You chose to attack me. Slowly, I sat down on the rocky ground. Even more questions churned and roiled in my mind. Finally, I practically screamed the one that kept coming to the forefront. Am I doomed to live this way forever? For the first time, I saw something like a smile spread across Wolf's features. Perhaps not, and perhaps fortune has led you to me. He bade me come closer to the fire, and he told me the story of an encounter he had almost 400 years before. He met a man traveling to Britain called Joseph of Arimathea. Are you familiar with the one they call Christ? I nodded, remembering what my father had told me about the Christians of his youth and about the teacher called St. Patrick. I recalled my conversation with Arthur about his shield and the image of Christ's mother emblazoned on its front. Those who follow him consider him a god, do they not? Those that follow him say he is an incarnation of the one and only God, corrected Wolf. They say he has the power to forgive even the most heinous sins. He went on to tell me about a cup and a scroll that Joseph of Arimathea carried. The cup was used during Jesus' last Passover feast. Some say it holds the blood of Christ himself, even to this day. Others say you pour wine into it and it transforms into his blood. You are but a fledgling, but could you imagine what it would mean for one such as us to drink of that cup, if that is the blood of a God, of the God, and it contained forgiveness of that magnitude? You said there was also a scroll, I asked. My mother had taught me to read Latin, and that knowledge served me well. No doubt it helped bring me to the attention of Ambrosius, his daughter, and the first dragons who instructed me. I loved to read, but there was little of value to read. Joseph said that it contained the writings of Jesus himself. I let out a breath. Through my father, Arthur, and others, I knew a little of the writings about Jesus. However, I had never once heard that Jesus himself had left behind any writings. That would indeed be a treasure. Why didn't you simply take the cup when you had the chance? It was guarded, he said bitterly. He went on to describe the eagle-like creature that attacked him, preventing him from taking the chest that contained the scroll and the cup. Over the centuries, I have encountered and heard many stories of creatures like that. Many take elemental forms, such as flames or vata. Others take animal forms, like this creature. Some people worship them as gods. I believe the Christians call these creatures, angels. What can one do against such a creature? I asked. They say these angels are immortal, said Wolf, baring his fangs. But I believe they can be wounded or even killed. I have been studying them over the centuries, and I think I know a way. That's why your becoming a Neuntoter may be particularly fortuitous. So where do we find this cup, this scroll? All I know is that it's here on the islands of Britain. I don't know where to begin the search. I may know someone that can help, I said. Even as I thought of enlisting Bran and Arthur's aid and seeing Guinevere again, I worried what she would think of my new sharp-toothed countenance, along with my need to drink blood in order to survive.